Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Regalia of Men and Monarchs for PC, Mac, and Linux. Full disclosure, I did receive a review copy of this to take a look at. This is a tactical role-playing game developed by Pixelated Milk and published by Clubbater. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of that. But anyway, it was released in May of this year after a successful Kickstarter campaign and has generally been pretty well received since its release. Although despite being pretty well received, it actually hasn't been covered all that much in the media side of things. Which of course brings up a couple of questions. The first of which is, how is this as a game? Does it do what it sets out to do and do it well? And second, why is it that it hasn't really been covered all that much? Well, let's go ahead and delve into this thing and see what we can find out. Well, before we get into the meat of the game, I do need to talk about the presentation. This runs in the Unity engine, and it features 2D backgrounds with 3D character models and animations. Whether you're in a cutscene or in the combat sections of the game, it runs in an isometric perspective, and it actually has a rather charming and colorful art style. Of course, the thing is that since it is a mixture of 2D and 3D graphics, the 3D graphics actually tend to clash a lot with the backgrounds, because the backgrounds have this sort of painted aesthetic to them a lot of the time, and the 3D models that they use for all of the characters and monsters and such simply do not. There's also the matter of the character animations not being particularly great. They do their job pretty well, but you're not seeing a lot of complex animations, you're seeing a lot of very vague gestures that are trying to convey conversation and such like that. Combat animations aren't particularly detailed, meaning that while they certainly do what they're supposed to, they aren't flashy and they don't look particularly great. That said, when you're actually seeing the combat animations, it does take place from an isometric perspective, and it is more about the tactics than about the animations, so that does help things, but it is mildly disappointing in that regard. Of course, all of the 2D artwork looks fine, so there's not really any problems there, but what really steals the show in terms of presentation here is the sound design, specifically the voice acting. All of the characters in this are voiced very competently, and they end up having quite a lot of charm and character as a result of the voice acting. This is especially noteworthy because the game is absolutely packed with humor, and that's pretty hard to do in terms of voice acting, so it's good that they managed to pull it off. Of course, less exciting are the sound effects, which pretty much just do their job and not much more than that. None of them are particularly high impact, none of them sound particularly great, they just work. And then of course the music, which admittedly is good, but it gets extremely repetitive extremely quickly because you're hearing the same few tracks over and over and over again. So despite it being generally fairly upbeat music that works rather well for the theme they're going for, the lack of variety in the music ends up taking it down. But of course that's not enough to ruin the presentation outright, and what you end up with is something of a mixed bag in terms of presentation that tends a bit more towards the better side of things. But of course what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and in the story in this game you take control of Kay and his siblings and their retainers in an attempt to basically restore the family name. You see, at the beginning of the game they find out that they are the heirs to the kingdom of Regalia, with Kay of course being the lord apparent of the entire house, and so they make their way to Regalia to reclaim their birthright, only to find that the entire place is a ruin and that their family actually was ridiculously deep in debt, so they have to find a way to pay that off in addition to restoring the kingdom. Along the way, they try to learn more and more about their family legacy, and they eventually start running into additional characters that will flesh out, of course, the party as well as the town. And I don't want to spoil too much of the plot here, so I'm not really going to go over it in great detail, but suffice to say, once you get about halfway through the game, you start to uncover some things that make it a lot more complicated than just, oh, your family had a massive debt and you're the heirs to the kingdom of Regalia. And for the most part, those revelations are pretty interesting, although I will say that the ending section of the game is a bit contrived and just kind of out of nowhere. This ultimately means that the ending comes across as a bit rushed, and it ends up being weaker than the plot leading up to it, so that really doesn't help things out all that much, especially when you compare it to the moment-to-moment character interactions that you're dealing with throughout the course of the game. Because each character does have their own specific personality, their own backstory, and their own story within the context of what you're doing in the game. And for the most part, the developers have done a very good job of giving those characters some personality, especially considering that there is such a premium on the humor in this game. Now, occasional spelling or grammar errors aside, keeping in mind, of course, that the developers are Polish and English is not their native language, You'll find that you'll actively be pursuing the personal bond system as well as going on as many text adventures as you possibly can, simply because those are the best parts of the game. The fact that the game doesn't really take itself very seriously and it is absolutely packed with this humor makes it actually a very charming game as far as the writing goes. That's not to say it's perfect. It actually has a fairly significant problem, that being it relies a bit too much on referential humor. You will notice tons of pop culture references throughout the game. You will notice tons of references to various gaming tropes and various other games throughout the entirety of the game. And while it is fairly amusing to break the fourth wall sometimes, when you put that many referential jokes in it, it does eventually become, okay, I see what you're doing there. Do you have anything better than this? But luckily the non-referential humor does help prop that up quite a bit, so it's not something that ends up outstaying its welcome. It's just something you will notice after a while, and if you don't like referential humor, then you probably won't be able to get anything out of it to begin with. And if it is the case where the humor falls entirely flat for you, then it's going to fall entirely to the gameplay to bring things up. In practical terms, that means that there are three aspects of the game to talk about. The first of them is the tactical combat system, the second is the town management system, and the third is the adventure system. We'll start with the adventure system since it is the shortest thing to talk about here. When you go into the dungeons, you will run into various text adventures that you will just be selecting different options in order to complete. So to give you an example, it would say something like, you reach a crossroad, do you go east or do you go west? And you have the options of east or west. And depending on which option you pick, it's going to lead to different outcomes for that particular text adventure. Sometimes this means you will be bestowed great treasures, sometimes it means you'll run into an enemy that you have to fight, and sometimes nothing at all happens. It just depends entirely on the individual text adventure, and some of them actually result in your party members not necessarily liking what you're doing. By the same token, some of your party members will approve what you're doing, so you might receive relationship points with one because you picked a certain option, but for another one you will actually lose relationship points. The problem with that is that it is really easy to generate relationship points with those particular characters just by spending time with them, which consumes an entire day, which I'll talk about in a moment, but you gain a large amount of relationship points with that particular character, and it pretty much negates any issues you might have run into within one of the text adventures. Not to mention that if you manage to get to the highest tier of the personal bond with that particular character, then losing relationship points with them doesn't matter at all anymore. So that particular part of the text adventures is rather underwhelming, but what's interesting about them is the actual stories that you'll run into. Some of them actually help expand a bit on the lore of the world around you, but most of them are just packed with silly little adventures that are just fun to do. So when you run into one when you're in a dungeon, then usually it's something to actually look forward to rather than be like, oh well, here we go, here's another one of these. Which is more than I can say for the combat system, which is a turn-based, grid-based tactical combat system where you place characters in the deployment zone up to the amount that the particular scenario allows for you, which in almost all cases is 4. And from there you try to satisfy the victory condition, which is usually defeat all enemies or defeat a specific enemy or last so many turns. Every character has 4 skills and then an additional signature skill. The signature skill is one that they have access to at all times. It's basically their basic attack, whereas the other 4 are all on a cooldown. In some cases they may even require a specific number of authority points, which are these special points that are generated basically once a turn, and they allow you to either take an additional action for that particular turn, or they allow you to use these particularly powerful skills. So to give you a prime example of that, if you spend 2 authority points, then you can actually have Alice summon the Lord of Fire, Garuu. In theory, these abilities are ridiculously powerful, and in practice, some of them are. Summoning the Lord of Fire, for example, is actually not that great of an idea because he's really not as powerful as you might think he is, given that he's such a ridiculously expensive ability. This brings up the issue that the combat is not anything remotely resembling balanced. It actually has level scaling, which goes off of your party level, because instead of having individual character levels, you have an overall party level. And you'll find that it always puts you at a pretty massive disadvantage, because once you get later on into the game, you'll find that it has scaled the hit points up to an absolutely ludicrous level. There were numerous points where my individual characters would maybe have 1,000 hit points, whereas the enemy would have a good 8 or so thousand, and on top of that they have a large amount of damage resistance, so I'm doing maybe 200 damage a hit at best, and they hit me for a good 500 points of damage. And it's not even like I'm playing on a so-called hard difficulty. I played on what is called the normal difficulty. Below that is the story mode, which I'm guessing just absolutely wimpifies the combat system. But on the normal difficulty setting, if this is what the game was intended to be played at, it is downright punishingly difficult. But it's not really the good kind of punishingly difficult, where you have to make use of a wide range of strategy in order to defeat your opponents. Instead, it's the, oh, my guys are missing constantly and barely doing any damage, where the enemy is taking away half of my health with a single hit kind of difficulty. And that's not helped by the tactical combat system being rather low in the actual tactical elements. There's not really any positioning that gives you any sort of bonuses or detriments. There's not really any sort of environmental interactions you can do to give your team an advantage. It's really just go to this grid space and then use this attack on an enemy if you're within range. Or in the case of some other abilities, use it on a friendly character to give them a buff as well as you a buff. There are consumable items you can also use, but those take up an action much the same as any of your abilities would, and most of those particular items are really not that helpful. And to make matters worse, if you go into a dungeon and there's multiple combat encounters, then you need to be especially careful, because if one of your characters goes down in the middle of a battle, you can't use them for a successive battle until you've actually rested at a campsite, which you can only do once per campsite. Because obviously what you need on top of punishing combat mechanics is punishing KO mechanics. Now this is worth noting because while I was playing this game, it actually received a couple of patches, the most recent of which actually introduced difficulty sliders to adjust the difficulty to your particular needs. Now that patch didn't come out until I had made it to the final chapter of the game, so the vast majority of the time I was going off of the default mechanics, and then I decided to mess around with the difficulty sliders, and that did actually help things out quite a bit. The thing is that if you go too far with it, then it makes the game pitifully easy, so I would recommend if you're going to mess around with the difficulty sliders, then be very careful with it, and just tweak it enough to where it gives you a challenge, but it doesn't make it overbearingly easy, or if for some baffling reason you think the game is too easy to begin with, in which case I wonder what planet you're from, then you can certainly make the game even more punishingly difficult if you want to. This greatly alleviated the biggest problem I had with this game, which was before those difficulty sliders were introduced, the combat was insufferable just because it was so punishing. It made me absolutely dread the dungeon crawling, as well as some of the quests where you have to go out and actually do various combat encounters, simply because the combat system was so infuriating to deal with. With the difficulty sliders in place, that's not so much of a problem anymore, and I was actually able to get into the dungeon crawling to some degree. But that leaves one other element of the gameplay, which is the actual town building aspect, where you go into your castle and you start constructing the various buildings as well as upgrading the existing buildings. This requires a very large amount of resources, including, of course, actual crafting components as well as the in-game money, so you need to go off and do all the dungeon crawling to build up the amount of resources and money you need to actually build stuff up in the town. This is especially important for certain characters' personal bonds because theirs are actually tied to their buildings. So for example, if you want to be able to craft trinkets, then you need to build up the Prospector's Shack, and if you don't do that, then you won't be able to get the requisite personal bond levels to unlock the higher and higher tiers of the various trinkets that you can craft. Now of course, personal bonds also give you other bonuses, things like the various perks that you can slot into your characters in order to give them various passive bonuses and different morphs for their skills, but the town building aspect is directly tied to those levels of crafting, whether it be for weapons, trinkets, or potions or other consumables. On top of that, the town building aspects are directly tied to the kingdom quests as well. You see, you have two different kinds of quests. You have kingdom quests, which are grand overall objectives, and then you have normal quests, which will be things like, oh, this buddy told you to go and do this thing so you can raise their personal bond level, or you managed to run into this one particular event in a dungeon, and that gave you a quest that you can go complete in order to get more XP and more items and things like that. You may wonder why you should care about the distinction, but every single chapter is actually tied to those kingdom quests. Every single chapter has a time limit of 54 days, and if you don't complete all of the objectives for that chapter within that time limit, game over. In some cases, the kingdom quests are very easy and very quick to complete. For example, the personal bond quests tend to just be, hey, get this number of people up to this particular status, which is really easy to do and does not take all that long. Others will be things like construct a certain number of buildings, or upgrade a certain number of buildings a certain number of times, or craft a certain number of trinkets or weapons. And then of course there's a kingdom quest per dungeon, so once you've completely cleared out that dungeon, you complete a kingdom quest for it. This is where the game's main strategy element comes into play, which is that it's a time management game. You primarily have to manage your time between the dungeon crawling and combat aspects, the town building aspects, and the interpersonal relationships with the characters. Because if you don't do that, then not only will you be pressed for time, but more likely than not, you will not be able to complete enough kingdom quests in order to get past that particular chapter, and then you have to start it all over again. Now, knowing what you know about how the dungeon crawling aspects and the combat aspects were before they introduced the difficulty sliders, you can probably imagine how ridiculously frustrating that got. As long as I was able to build up all of the personal bonds, it was actually very manageable to be able to go through the various chapters and get further on into the story. Once I had exhausted all of the personal bond quests and all of the town building quests, and I had even exhausted the fishing quests, which more on fishing in a moment, then it was pretty much just left to crafting and dungeon crawling, as well as leveling up, because you get also kingdom quests for leveling up your party to certain levels. That meant that by the end of the game, pretty much all I had left was combat, and the combat is the weakest part of the game. A much better strategy, of course, would be to intersperse the actual dungeon crawling within the chapters as opposed to going all for one particular thing at once. To make matters worse, sometimes you will actually get chapter quests in addition to the kingdom quests you have to complete. So if you don't complete the kingdom quests and that particular quest that was given to you at the beginning of the chapter, then you still fail the chapter. Now most of the time those quests were not a big problem. They would take maybe a couple of in-game days to complete, but you have to keep in mind, whenever you travel on the overland map, moving one space costs you a day, in addition to the 7 or 8 days it usually takes to go through a dungeon, in addition to the actual amount of days it takes to complete the quests. Because some quests just are go to this location, do stuff there, and then just come back to Regalia once you're done, which that's pretty manageable, whereas others require you to go off and do multiple things out in the overworld before you're finally done with it. And while I can certainly attest that it is all manageable, it's something you really have to be cognizant of when you're playing the game, because if you're not, then you're going to find, wait a minute, what just happened? The game's over. And you realize, oh, I spent too much time dilly-dallying. Now, if you want to dilly-dally and just mess around with everything and see what you can actually get done, then you can actually go into the post-game and you no longer have a time limit. But you have to beat the game to get to that. On top of this, there are certain decisions that you'll be able to make throughout the game that will side you with one faction or another, and that will give you different characters to mess around with. For example, if you side with Lordamar and you just constantly stick with Lordamar, then eventually you will unlock the character Henrietta, whereas if you side with Shedu, then eventually you'll unlock Esther. These are characters who will actually join the party and be usable in combat. And that's on top of all the other bonuses you get from those particular factions. So there is some degree of replayability to see what kind of different things you can do with those characters, as well as see what difference the various factions have versus one another. But beyond that, there's not really all that much in the main gameplay that is going to keep you coming back. You're certainly not going to keep coming back for the fishing minigame, where you just hammer the mouse button until the fish is showing up in the box, and if you keep it there for 5 seconds, then you get either a fish or an item or a piece of junk. Which of course can be sold at the merchant, which is actually what I ended up doing with most of the gear that I managed to find from fishing, so that's kind of a moot point. But here's the thing. When you bring everything together, then you find that even though the combat is the weakest part of the game and there is frankly too much of it, the rest of the game, for the most part, is able to compensate for this. The writing and the voice acting really do help quite a lot in that regard, because then you're constantly dealing with this sense of humor that really does lighten your mood after a particularly rough dungeon crawling session. And while I certainly would have liked to see more depth in the town building aspects, what they've got there is certainly adequate for a game that is not trying to be a major town building game or a simulator. And while the fishing minigame just plain sucks, at least it's something that you can avoid entirely if you want. But the fact remains that there is a major distinction between what this game does well, which is its writing and sense of humor, and what it doesn't do well, which are the combat and the fishing minigame. Everything else in the game falls somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, because even though the character interactions are interesting, the actual relationship system is a just straight up, do you have enough relationship points to move on to the next level? If so, attempt to move on to the next level. If not, then gain more relationship points by spending more time with that character. It's a rather mechanically shallow system, and since the focus is more on the writing aspects of it anyway, it doesn't really matter as much, but it is a missed opportunity there. Now, of course, it's also worth noting that it didn't necessarily meet a couple of its Kickstarter promises, namely that they said there were going to be 6 factions in the game when it turned out there's 4, but it's entirely possible that those sorts of things can be added in a content update, and since the developers are actively patching the game quite a lot, that is actually a pretty distinct possibility. But of course, only time will tell in that particular regard. As for what we have right now, it's overall a pretty decent game. It does have quite a lot of problems, and they are well on their way to fixing some of those problems. But of course, there is the one unavoidable problem they have of this being a rather niche game, and there's not really much they can do to escape that. Of course, that's perfectly fine. They were aiming at this being a niche game to begin with. That's why they took to Kickstarter in the first place. And for what they set out to do, they've done a relatively decent job of it, even though it has taken several updates to finally get the game balancing in a somewhat acceptable state. We'll see where it goes from here and what they decide to do with the base they've built, but as it stands, if you're looking for a game that has a tactical turn-based combat system in a sort of JRPG-esque style, as well as text adventures that have branching paths, and of course a town management aspect and time management aspects, then you could definitely do a lot worse than Regalia of Men and Monarchs. It's not remotely perfect, but it does have quite a bit of charm that helps bring it up quite a lot. Which of course brings me to my main conclusion. This is not a game I can recommend to a general audience. It is very, very niche. But within its niche, now that it's had a few balancing patches, it's actually pretty solid. And as a result, I give it a very conditional 3.5 out of 5. Again, this is not the kind of game I can recommend to a general audience, but if you're in the niche that this is catering to, then you'll probably be able to enjoy it. Thanks for watching.